have Stine Grodal, who will speak about archival methods.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for your great talk. I really kind of agree with everything you said, and I also love Shamas, and I agree so much with the fact that we need to choose the method that really suits our question and the thing that we want to answer. And I agree with you that interviews really have such a strength in trying to understand what people are actually thinking. So what is going on inside of their minds? Why are they actually doing what they are doing? And so even though I'm going to here talk about archival methods, I agree that interviews is one of the kind of core tools in our toolkit here. But as you mentioned also in the beginning of your talk, Kevin, then people are beginning to use archival methods more. And so what is archival methods? Well, it is the analysis of textual traces. And these kind of texts can be left behind by people, by organizations, by markets. And so they can be things like blogs, social media entries, internal company documents, trade journal articles, press releases, newspaper articles, all of these data that are becoming increasingly available for us to use. But I know that a lot of people find it difficult to use this kind of data. As you mentioned, Kevin, in your talk, then sometimes the papers that are generated with this data seem to be maybe more superficial. Some of that also has to do with the fact, I think, that we are still learning how to analyze this data and get the most out of it. And I think that we need to use a new kind of method when we attack this kind of data than we have done in the past when we use interviews or ethnographies in order to answer our research questions. Because traditionally that has been interviews and ethnographic observations have been the kind of standard way in which we've been doing qualitative research. But now the availability of all of this archival data that is available just on the internet and in libraries, things that are being scanned, even historically going back hundreds of years, enables us to answer new kinds of questions but leaves us with this question about how do we really get the most out of this kind of data. And so why would we actually want to use archival data? As Kevin was saying, interviews are great at getting at the why, why are people doing this? But however, it also has some limitations because we are often just one person or a team of researchers. So if we have to do interviews, we have to be on site. We have to be real time with the people that we have to talk to. We need to get access to them. I know that in coming into the conference, a lot of you participants wrote to us that a problem that you had in doing qualitative research was access to data. Well, here, archival data is actually available to all of us on the internet. So even if you don't come from a privileged institution and you have difficulties accessing interviewees, you will be able to access archival data. And archival data also allows us to study real-time actions. That is the things that people do on an ongoing basis. We see these traces of what people do within organizations or between organizations or within markets unfolding inside the archival data. We can also study things across time. As researchers, we are limited because we live in the now, right? And we have to publish a paper within a year or 2 years, right? We cannot study something for 30 years. Well, with archival data, we can go back in time and study the development of organizational phenomena that evolve over a 100-year period, something we cannot do with other kinds of data. We can also study things across space. Maybe we are doing our research in Zimbabwe. However, we will, through archival data, be able to access what's going on with the domain we are interested in. For example, work-family balance. You can access archival data about that all over the world at the same time, which is something you would not be able to do with other kinds of data. You'll also be able to study phenomena that cross organizations, and that happens in markets or in inter-organizational phenomenon that are more difficult to study, let's say with ethnographic observations, where we need to be present at a particular point in time. We can also study novel phenomenon and ask questions that we otherwise would not be able to do. We might, for example, also access data about things that have people would not want to talk about or that are hidden. So, for example, I've myself done research on the tobacco industry using archival data that was released through the big lawsuits that were happening towards the tobacco companies. These companies would never talk to us, but we get ideas about what did they think, why were they doing this, what were their strategic action through the archival data that was released by these organizations. However, there are two difficulties main difficulties in doing archival research. The first one is data abundance. Whereas in traditional research, qualitative research, we have had the problem of data scarcity. It's difficult to actually access data. Here we have the opposite problem. There's too much data. We might have several thousand blog entries. And what are we going to do about it? How are we going to analyze that? Because as a researcher, we are actually limited in our cognitive capacity and the time we have to analyze thousands and thousands of articles. This means that we need to develop new methods for how to sample archival data. The other problem is data heterogeneity. So if you do an interview, you are the one collecting the data, and you will ask probing questions, as Kevin was talking about, to get at the things that might answer your research question. In archival data, people produce this data with a different goal in mind. They were created by different people in different contexts with different goals in mind. They come in different forms. There might be images, there might be texts, there might be numbers. So how do we deal with this data heterogeneity? That is a problem in qualitative data because, as Jennifer Howard Granville and the editors at AMJ stated, that actually it's core to qualitative research to achieve fit. We need simplicity, and that's difficult to achieve across this heterogeneity of data, right? And so thus, I'm going to talk to you about a method in order to address this, which I call dynamic theorizing, which attacks these two problems through both constantly sampling data and constantly theorizing archival data. Because if we think about sampling, then traditionally we have engaged in theoretical sampling, and we have only entered the field for most of us only one time, even though we are told we need to do it many times. It's not practically doable for us to do that. So, but now with archival data, we can actually sample and go back to the sample all the time because it's right there at our fingertips. We can do a search, a query 1 minute, and 5 minutes later, we can do a new query. So sampling and accessing the data is something that can be done ongoing several times, hundreds of times throughout the research process. And so we also need to think about reaching saturation, which is the concept we normally think about as when we need to access the data. That in archival data, because it's so heterogeneous, it's difficult to reach this saturation point. So instead, we need to reach saturation on individual constructs instead. So I'll explain this more to you. And so what we need to do is actually borrow from quantitative research and do representative sample, statistical sample to create a smaller sample that we can use. And from that begin to do theoretical sampling. So what we need to do when we do archival research is that we need to start with a very small sample. This is the very important first step. You need to even you have thousands of blog posts, you need to first think about creating a very small sample, either based on what you're interested in, based on maybe secondary sources. You'll create a very small sample and you'll begin to know about your context, maybe